Good afternoon. Today I'll be presenting my method WIP. As a reminder, the title of this research endeavor is An Evaluation of Educational Anti-Trafficking Programs in United States Middle and High Schools and the Feasibility of Implementing One in Atlanta Area Schools. To begin, the researcher decided to employ a qualitative design method that focused on a content analysis paired with structured interviews. As described by Leedy and Ormrod in their 2015 book, Practical Research, they found that the content analysis is the most efficient way to express the data found in a field of study and would help to identify common categories within programs that are being evaluated. I chose the content analysis because of this, due to the fact that the researcher was going to be choosing 3 programs to evaluate and identify common categories within them. Then the researcher decided to choose to use structured interviews to help provide more robust data and support the data found in the content analysis. Specifically for the content analysis, the data did come from websites. The websites were from the programs that the researcher did evaluate. The limitation to this is that there was a lack of scholarly reviewed information, but on the other hand, there was no scholarly reviewed information on this topic, specifically through programs that the researcher did choose, so there was really no other option in place to find information. Within the content analysis specifically, the researcher did analyze similarities and differences between the program's mission statements and goal statements that they had to see if there was common wording and then common themes within them. And the researcher did employ purposive sampling, and they had 6 categories that they wanted each program to meet. First of all, they had to be within the United States. They also had to have programs for both middle and high schools, not just one or the other. There also had to be some kind of common core adherence, whether it was just statewide or nationwide, it had to be in place. There also had to be a huge focus on education on sex trafficking, not just human trafficking as a whole, but specifically the category of sex trafficking. Then there had to be information available on the amount of schools that they had implemented the program in to see if it had been, if it was widespread enough to be evaluated. And lastly, they had to be able to be feasibly implemented in other cities, not necessarily just Atlanta, but they had to have a program in place to bring in people or trainers to train new officials on how to implement it in new schools. Moving on, the researcher decided to use the structured interviews, specifically in the form of questionnaires. They decided to use these because they found it to be a form of more efficient communication, and the lack of face-to-face interaction allowed for a limited possibility of ethical violations. And then this data collection method also allowed the researcher to expedite the responses rapidly, as the interviews did not have to be scheduled, so the respondees could email back the researcher at any point, which was most convenient for them. Lastly, however, the limitation, as with all human participant studies, is that they have the potential to be unreliable and provide bias due to their human nature. The participants had to meet 3 categories in order to be chosen. As there were 3 programs that were evaluated in the content analysis, that was directly proportional to the participants chosen for the questionnaires. So there were 3 people who were interviewed overall. Then these 3 people were, each of them was a program director of one of the 3 programs chosen for the content analysis. And this population had access to information about sex trafficking specifically, so they were more educated than the general population would have been. For procedures, the researcher did send out the questionnaires through email in the afternoon to accommodate the 9 to 5 work schedule for the interviewees, and then the 8 to 2 school schedule for the researcher itself. And once responses were received from the participants, the researcher did send out a consent form so that they were able to use the information provided to them. Specifically, the researcher did use one set of uniform questions for all 3 interviewees. They were mostly open-ended, and there were 2 opinion questions, but the researcher did account for this in their limitation section. Lastly, for ethical considerations, the researcher did receive IRB approval, and they also received all 3 informed consent forms back signed so that the researcher was able to use the data that they collected. And then once all the data was collected and evaluated, then the researcher decided to destroy them. And that's it.